James stood motionless at the edge of the debris, his breath catching in his throat. The house was gone, reduced to a pile of shattered wood, splintered drywall, and personal belongings scattered like the remnants of a battle. The breeze carried the scent of dust and freshly broken timber, ruffling the tattered space posters that had once decorated a child's room. They fluttered on the remains of a collapsed fence, hanging limply like surrender flags after a war lost without a fight. Among the wreckage, a tangle of NASA bed sheets lay half-buried beneath chunks of roof tiles, their once pristine white now smudged with dirt and grit. The sight of them made something tighten in James's chest, a constriction not unlike the tension he had felt in combat zones, except this battlefield was his own neighborhood. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger rise, slow and steady, pushing against the initial numbness. This wasn't just a house that had been demolished. This was a life, a home, a history erased without warning. His cousin had fought to stop this, had filed the necessary legal paperwork, had done everything right, and yet the HOA had ignored it all. And now, standing in the ruins, James knew this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, calculated act, the gathered crowd murmured, shifting uneasily as the weight of silence pressed down on them. Then, from the cluster of neighbors, a young woman hesitated before stepping forward. James recognized her. Sarah, the quiet woman from 3 doors down, the one who always sat at the back of HOA meetings, too nervous to voice her thoughts. Now, her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, her face pale but determined. "I have videos of everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They started at dawn. They ignored your cousin's legal papers." Her gaze flicked nervously toward Karen, the iron-fisted enforcer of the HOA, who stood stiffly with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. Sarah swallowed hard before continuing. I heard Mrs. Matthews on the phone last night. She was talking about how the demolition had to happen before you got back." A hushed ripple spread through the crowd, gasps, muttered curses, the shifting of feet as realization set in. It had all been planned. The HOA had orchestrated the destruction under the assumption that no one would dare challenge them. But Sarah, despite her fear, had dared to speak. And with those few words, the dam of silence cracked point one by one. More neighbors stepped forward, their voices gaining strength as the fear that had kept them silent for so long began to dissolve. A middle-aged man lifted his phone, playing back a shaky video of workers tearing into the structure, their bulldozers relentless even as a few bystanders protested in vain. A woman, her face flushed with anger, held up printed emails, exchanges between Karen and the HOA board, where they callously discussed the urgency of removing the house before legal action could stop them. Another neighbor pulled out meeting minutes, highlighting the parts where concerns had been raised and immediately dismissed. "They threatened us," an elderly man muttered, his wrinkled hands gripping the papers he held. "Said if we interfered, we'd face fines. Or worse." The confessions tumbled out faster now, overlapping in a crescendo of long-buried resentment. Everyone had a story, threats of unjust penalties, underhanded deals, intimidation tactics. 4 years, they had endured it, afraid to challenge the HOA's authority. But today, something had changed. Today, they weren't just whispering their grievances in the shadows. They were standing together, out in the open, their collective voices rising in defiance. Karen's expression remained eerily composed, though a muscle in her jaw twitched as the accusations piled up. She uncrossed her arms and took a deliberate step forward, tilting her chin upward. "This is all very dramatic," she said, her voice sharp, clipped. "But the demolition was entirely legal. The house was in violation of multiple HOA regulations. Your cousin had ample time to comply. And as for these so-called threats," she let out a humorless laugh, "you all signed the HOA agreements. You knew the rules." Her gaze swept over the crowd, daring someone to challenge her. For a moment, the old power dynamic threatened to reassert itself, the familiar weight of HOA dominance pressing down like a heavy fog. But James had spent too many years in high-stakes environments to be intimidated by bureaucratic arrogance. He stepped forward, locking eyes with her, his expression unreadable. "If you're so confident it was legal," he said calmly, "you won't mind a full-scale investigation, then?" The smugness on Karen's face faltered. Just slightly. But James caught it. And so did the crowd. James turned back to the neighbors, his stance shifting from quiet observer to natural leader. "I need every piece of evidence you have," he said, his voice steady, authoritative. "Videos, emails, notes, Anything that proves what happened here. He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket and started taking down names, numbers, details. The same precision he had once applied to military operations now guided his actions here, systematic, strategic. As neighbors handed over their evidence, their expressions shifted from fearful to resolute. The HOA had controlled them for too long. But now, with undeniable proof in their hands and a leader willing to take the fight forward, they had a chance. A real chance. James met Sarah's gaze and nodded in quiet appreciation. She had been the first to step forward, the first to break the silence. And now, because of her, they had momentum. He turned back to Karen, who was no longer smirking, no longer so sure of her dominance. "This isn't over," James told her. "Not by a long shot." As James surveyed the wreckage once more, a deep, unshakable anger settled in his gut. The house had been more than just walls and a roof. It had been a home filled with memories, late-night conversations, childhood laughter, and the quiet security of knowing there was a place to return to. Now, it was nothing but broken pieces scattered across the lot, and the people responsible were standing here, pretending it was just another procedural matter. His cousin had fought to keep this place, had filed legal paperwork, had done everything within his rights, and yet it hadn't mattered. The HOA had decided they were above the law, had pushed forward before anyone could stop them. James felt his fingers tighten around the small notebook he was holding. He had seen destruction before, had walked through villages torn apart by war, had witnessed the aftermath of explosions that left families with nothing. But this? This was supposed to be a neighborhood, a community. Yet it had been ruled by fear and control, and now the true cost of that unchecked power lay before him. But he had spent too many years following orders to let this go unanswered. He was done watching people suffer while those in power walked away. The realization spread through the crowd like wildfire. This wasn't just about one house. It was about all of them. About the late fees that seemed arbitrary, the citations that conveniently targeted specific homeowners, the sudden rule changes that benefited only a select few. The HOA had operated unchecked for too long, using fear and intimidation to keep everyone in line. But now, standing in the wreckage of their neighbor's home, something shifted. "We should have done something sooner," an older woman murmured, her voice heavy with regret. "They've been doing this for years." A younger man, holding his phone tightly, nodded. "Well, we're doing something now," he said. "We're not backing down." There was a collective murmur of agreement, voices rising in support of action. People exchanged numbers, started organizing, discussing ways to bring legal action against the HOA. It was no longer just James fighting this battle. It was an entire neighborhood waking up, realizing that they had power when they stood together. Karen's confidence was slipping. For years, she had ruled with absolute authority, knowing that most people were too scared or too indifferent to challenge her. But this was different. She could feel the tide turning against her, could see the way people were looking at her now, no longer with quiet resignation but with anger, with resolve. "You're all overreacting," she said, attempting to regain control. "This is how communities stay orderly, by following the rules. If you didn't want to be part of an HOA, you shouldn't have moved here." But no one was listening. James stepped forward, holding up the phone of the man who had recorded the demolition. "This footage alone is enough to get an attorney involved," he said, his voice measured but firm. "And that's before we get into the emails, the meeting minutes, the threats. So, Karen, are you really sure you want to keep pretending this is just business as usual?" For the first time, Karen hesitated. The power she had wielded for so long was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. James didn't waste any time. He turned to Sarah and the others, speaking with the efficiency of someone used to organizing people under pressure. "We need to compile everything," he said. "Put it in a folder, back it up on multiple devices, and get it in the hands of a lawyer as soon as possible." A few neighbors nodded, already pulling up contacts on their phones. "And we need a public record," another woman added. "Social media, news outlets. If we keep this quiet, they'll find a way to bury it." James agreed. This had to be bigger than just their neighborhood. If they wanted real accountability, they had to expose everything. The HOA had operated in the shadows for too long, relying on the fear of individual homeowners. But against a united front, against undeniable proof, they wouldn't be able to escape the consequences. As people began organizing, James could already see the next battle lines forming, not just in the courts, but in the hearts of every homeowner who had been too afraid to fight back. Until now, Karen turned away, her jaw tight, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't used to losing. But this was no longer her game to control. As neighbors continued to gather evidence, as plans were made, as voices that had once been silenced grew louder, she felt the walls closing in. The HOA had always operated under the assumption that fear would keep people in check, that no one would dare challenge the system. But they had underestimated one thing: people could only be pushed so far before they fought back. James exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about making sure no one else had to go through this. He didn't know exactly how this fight would end, but he knew one thing for certain: the days of the HOA ruling unchecked were over. And as he looked around at his neighbors, at Sarah, at the people who had once been too afraid to speak, he knew they were ready to see this through, whatever it took. James had every right to sell the property for a significant profit or use it for his personal gain, but instead, he chose to do something far more meaningful. Recognizing the struggles that many veterans face when transitioning back to civilian life, especially those dealing with financial hardship, PTSD, or disabilities, he made a selfless decision. He donated the land to be transformed into an affordable housing community specifically for veterans, ensuring that those who had once put their lives on the line for their country would have a stable and secure place to call home. This wasn't just an act of charity, it was a strategic move to create long-term solutions for people who are often overlooked. By working closely with local organizations, veteran support groups, and even some government agencies, James ensured that the project wouldn't just be a collection of buildings but a well-planned community equipped with resources like counseling services, job placement assistance, and healthcare access. His generosity didn't just change lives, it laid the foundation for a movement that would inspire countless others to step up and support those who have served. The reality of transitioning from military to civilian life is often far more challenging than many people realize. Veterans return home expecting to integrate seamlessly into society, but instead, they face obstacles like difficulty finding employment, a lack of affordable housing, and mental health struggles that often go unaddressed. James understood these challenges, which is why the housing initiative wasn't just about providing a roof over someone's head, it was about creating an environment where veterans could thrive. The project ensured that former service members had access to essential resources like career training, mentorship programs, and support networks that would help them build stable, fulfilling lives after their time in uniform. It also fostered a sense of camaraderie, something many veterans miss after leaving the military. In this community, they wouldn't have to face their struggles alone. They would be surrounded by people who understood their experiences and were ready to lend a helping hand. This initiative wasn't just a place to live, it was a new beginning. The excitement surrounding the project reached its peak as the first families prepared to move in. For many of them, this wasn't just about finding a new home, it was about reclaiming their dignity, stability, and hope for the future. Some of these veterans had been homeless, living in shelters, or barely making ends meet in temporary housing. Others had been struggling with PTSD or injuries that made it difficult to work, leaving them in precarious financial situations. Now, for the first time in years, they had a place where they felt safe, where they could rebuild their lives without the constant stress of wondering where they would sleep next. Volunteers, donors, and supporters from all over the community came together to make the transition smooth, helping with everything from furnishing apartments to organizing welcome events. It was a powerful moment, not just for the families moving in but for everyone who had been part of the journey. This was proof that when people come together for a cause, real change can happen. One of the most unexpected developments in the entire situation was the involvement of Karen's daughter. Karen had once been at the center of a selfish and unethical scheme, prioritizing her greed over the well-being of others. However, the fallout from her actions had a ripple effect, particularly on her daughter, who watched everything unfold and saw firsthand the consequences of prioritizing personal gain over the needs of the community. Rather than following in her mother's footsteps, she made a choice to do better. Volunteering to help veterans move in and settle into their new homes, she demonstrated a genuine desire to make amends and contribute to something positive. She helped organize furniture deliveries, welcomed families, and even took the time to listen to their stories, learning about the sacrifices they had made and the struggles they had endured. Through this experience, she gained a deeper understanding of responsibility, empathy, and what it truly means to give back. In the end, her actions proved that people can change, And sometimes the best lessons come from witnessing the mistakes of those before us. Ironically, if Karen hadn't been so consumed by greed, none of this might have happened. Her attempt to manipulate the system for her own benefit had the unintended consequence of shedding light on a much bigger issue: the widespread difficulties that many military families face when trying to secure stable housing. It forced people to take a closer look at the broken systems in place and question why so many veterans were struggling to find a place to live after dedicating their lives to serving their country. The controversy surrounding her actions sparked discussions, drew media attention, and, most importantly, inspired people to take action. Without Karen's missteps, the community might never have come together in the way that it did. Instead of being a purely negative event, her actions served as a catalyst for something far greater than she could have ever imagined. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes, the worst situations can lead to the most meaningful changes, proving that even in the face of greed and selfishness, good can still emerge. What started as a single act of generosity quickly grew into something much bigger: a united community dedicated to supporting veterans and their families. People from all walks of life, including local businesses, schools, and even complete strangers, came together to contribute in any way they could. Some donated money to help cover housing costs, while others volunteered their time to assist with renovations, landscaping, and setting up essential services. This wasn't just about building homes, it was about fostering a sense of belonging. Veterans often struggle with feelings of isolation after leaving the military, but in this new community, they found camaraderie and understanding. Neighbors looked out for one another, children played together, and families shared meals and stories, creating an environment reminiscent of the close-knit bonds formed during military service. The project proved that when people come together for a cause, they don't just change lives, they build something lasting, something that stands as a beacon of hope for future generations of veterans. In Nifir the narrator, the entire experience was a journey of transformation. In the beginning, anger and frustration were natural responses to the injustice that had occurred. Karen's actions had been selfish, manipulative, and harmful, leaving many to wonder how someone could be so indifferent to the struggles of others. But as time passed and the impact of her mistakes became clear, the anger began to fade, replaced by a sense of gratitude. If Karen hadn't been so focused on her own interests, the urgent need for veteran housing might have remained hidden for much longer. The narrator came to see that sometimes, even the worst situations can lead to unexpected blessings. Instead of dwelling on resentment, they chose to focus on the good that had come from it all: the homes that had been built, the lives that had been changed, and the powerful sense of purpose that had emerged. In the end, Karen's greed had, ironically, sparked something truly meaningful, proving that even the most negative events can lead to profound positive change. One of the most profound realizations that came out of this experience was the idea that sometimes, losing something makes room for something even better. Many of the veterans moving into the housing project had lost so much: homes, stability, careers, and in some cases, their sense of identity. The transition from military to civilian life had not been easy for them, and the road had been filled with hardships. But now, standing in front of their new homes, they saw that their losses had led them to something far greater. This wasn't just about having a place to live, it was about rebuilding from the ground up, surrounded by people who understood their journey. It was a lesson in resilience, in finding strength in adversity, and in realizing that even when things seem to be falling apart, they might actually be coming together in ways we never expected. These veterans, who had once felt forgotten, now had a place where they truly belonged. James didn't stop after donating the property. His work was just beginning. With his background in law and advocacy, he had seen firsthand how veterans were often mistreated, ignored, or forced to fight unnecessary battles just to secure the rights they had already earned. He made it his mission to continue standing up for them, tackling legal cases and challenging policies that unfairly targeted former service members. He worked to help veterans secure disability benefits, fight wrongful evictions, and navigate complicated housing laws. Every day, he encountered new stories of injustice, stories that fueled his determination even more. He wasn't just fighting individual cases. He was working to change the system itself, pushing for new policies and reforms that would make life easier for all veterans, not just those in his immediate community. His determination was unwavering, and those who knew him had no doubt that he would continue this mission for as long as the latest case James took on was yet another example of why his work was so necessary. A retired Navy SEAL in Florida was facing an absurd and unfair battle with his homeowners association, HOA, which was attempting to ban his service dog. Despite the fact that service animals are legally protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the HOA was determined to enforce its restrictive policies, claiming that the dog violated neighborhood regulations. But James and his team had already dealt with their fair share of bullies, and they weren't about to let this injustice stand. They knew exactly how to fight back, using legal expertise, public awareness, and the support of their growing community to challenge the HOA's decision. They had seen what happened when people underestimated veterans before, and they weren't about to let it happen again. This fight, like the ones before it, would serve as a reminder that veterans deserved respect, dignity, and fairness, and that they had a whole community standing behind them, ready to take on anyone who tried to take that away.